In preparing for this morning, I asked myself a couple of questions. Questions such as, what is the Bible? Where does the Bible come from? How did we get it? How old is it? Who wrote it? Where was it written? And why is it so important to us? And so allow me to run you through those questions, pointing to some of the answers. The Bible, as we have it, is this book, and there might be some in the pews, and if you have a copy at home, that's good. You could also have several copies on your phone, which is why I didn't pack my phone away this morning, because there's an app called YouVersion, which is a free app for those of you who do run with apps. And on YouVersion, you can get the Bible in virtually any language, and there's probably several translations in every one of those languages as well. It's very common in that sense. But it's a collection of texts that is synonymous with Christian religion. So other religions in the world also have sacred scriptures, but they don't call it the Bible. The Bible is ours. It's part of our Christianity. It has roots in the Torah and the books of the Hebrews. The Torah is a very important set of scriptures for Judaism, for instance. And we share our Old Testament, and I'll get to what that is, with Judaism. So they read similar scriptures in the Old Testament to what we read. It's a compendium of ancient history, of rules, of regulations, of divine ordinances that shape and enlighten and govern Christian religion and beliefs. It tells the story of the existence of the earth and the universe as we know it. It tells the story of God and that creation. More specifically, the Bible tells the story of God with the crown of creation, which is people. You and I, and people throughout a very long history. It has shaped laws and politics in many Western countries. It has influenced language and art and music in a way that cannot be ignored. And today, it continues to inspire many millions of people around the world. The Bible is a remarkable collection of ancient writings, and I use the word ancient because it's ancient. The content in these pages were not dreamt up or written down last week or last year or even in the last decade. But some of it is thousands of years old. Mind you, most of it is thousands of years old. And perhaps it's better to think of the Bible as a library rather than a book. There are two parts in this book, in this library, two big portions, an Old Testament and a New Testament. And those words may seem familiar to us as Christians, but those of us who are not familiar with these words, all it really refers to, the Old Testament is the writings before Jesus, and the New Testament is the writings of Jesus' life and the early church just after that. And so there are 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. Now, perhaps I need to put an asterisk in here to say that is true for most Christian Bibles. There are, like our Catholic brothers across the road, they have a few extra books, and they have a few extra bits at the end of Daniel, for instance, and Esther. But for the vast majority of Christians around the world, 39 Old Testament books and 27 New Testament books form what we know as the Bible. Now, I've already said that it's made up of different kinds of writings, and it's fantastic to read. There is poetry, there is history, there are letters of instruction, there is law and wisdom and prophetic books. There is a lot of different, shall I call it, genres, all made up in this library. And all of it tells the story of God and people, God with people. And our life as Christians is a continuation of that story, and that's the beauty of the Bible. It's a revelation of who God is, of God's walk with his people, or shall I say people's walk with God, and that continues to this day. And so this is our story, although I've said this many times before, I have no Jewish blood in me at all. But it's my story because of the grace of God. The New Testament, the one we most frequently read and that has had the biggest influence on Christianity, is made up of 4 Gospels, 1 history book, and 21 letters to different churches and individuals, and then 1 prophetic book. Now, over centuries, billions of people have read this library and have been touched by the content thereof and the revelation of God through the pages of the Bible. It's been translated into 700 languages. Might be more, but 700 languages is what my research turned up. It's hard to get specific figures of how many Bibles have been sold, but it's widely regarded as the best-selling book of all time. And yet, at the same time, it's also the book that the general man on the street wants nothing to do with. Today, in today's world, in today's age, quoting biblical scriptures closes the discussion rather than opens it up. But yet, our world, even New Zealand, has been significantly shaped by the Bible. Our history tells a beautiful story of how God's revelation through the words of these papers changed not just what people did, but changed who they were, as it changed you and I. And so it's a fantastic book in that sense. Now, to answer the second question, who wrote it, is a bit more challenging. It was written by more than 40 people, at least. And the time period is over 1,000 years from the beginning to the end. More than 1,000 years. Wrap your head around that. Some of the writers were kings and royal officials, poets, even a doctor attempted to write some of it. Not just attempted, but succeeded in writing some of it. Some parts were written by poor and uneducated people, and others by philosophers. And although we know much of this, we also have to say that there are parts of our Bible which we simply don't know who wrote it. We think, but we don't know. For instance, tradition has told us that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but how can he write about his own death? So someone else must have helped write that story. That's not to say Moses did not write much of that, but it points us to the questions we have that we don't have specific answers for. And so, where was this written? Now, I have to say, to understand where it was written, we need to understand that it wasn't written at all. At first, rather, it wasn't written. If you were to draw a timeline throughout world history, and I know this is a bit of a lecture at the moment, not so much a sermon. I'll get to the application part. But if you draw a timeline and you see when language developed and when people started writing, you would remember perhaps the hieroglyphs that the Egyptians are so famous for, those picture languages. Even older than that were some, what do they call that now? They had wet clay tablets and sharp objects of different triangular shapes, and they just made little images, really. And it told a story. But before that, the Bible, the stories that are contained, were conveyed in stories and songs and psalms and in the telling of one generation to the next. It was important in those oral tradition tribes and cultures that the stories be conveyed, and they told it over and over and over again. So much so that it influenced cultures even today. And for instance, the Jewish culture and in the Jewish tradition, they tell these stories in song. And you may have seen in videos and movies that boys do what they call a bar mitzvah at some stage. And it's right then where their voices are breaking. So they don't sound so stable. They go up and down, you know. And they sing a song. How mean is that? Just when your voice isn't quite stable, we ask you to sing a song in front of a bunch of people. What are they singing? They're singing the Bible. They're singing those ancient Hebrew scriptures. And they memorize it through these songs. And that's how it worked in oral traditions. We told the stories, we sang the songs. As you worked and as you lived, you just told these things. But then language developed, and the ability to write things down became part of how the world operated. And it was led through the religious communities, very much so through Judaism. And it started taking on form. I've already said Moses was recognized at writing a big portion of the Old Testament. I found that fascinating. He's the guy saying, I can't talk. Lord, use someone else. I can't speak. And yet he said so much that it filled 5 books in the Old Testament. Well done to a guy who couldn't speak. And so it started taking on form, that some of it was written down. The law, for instance, might have been some of the first bits that were written down. They received from God tablets with writing on it. That mere telling there requires that language had developed to a point where people could read. Why would God give them a tablet with language on it that they can't understand? And so the Bible is intricately linked to the history of mankind and the history of time and understanding of how language developed and how written languages developed. And so to answer where it was written, we need to acknowledge that some of it was written, where's my notes? Here we go. Some of it was written in Jerusalem, some of it in Babylon, some of it in what we call Turkey. We found ancient manuscripts of the Bible in Egypt. And so it was written in that part of the world. But to pin it, to say it was written in this place, on this desk, with this pencil, by this person, is simply not possible. 1,000 years, 40 writers, it's not something we are able to do. And so, somewhere around just before Jesus was born, actually, 100 or so years before Jesus was born, the Old Testament was pretty much in the shape that we have it today. And the church of the time, the various churches of the time, joined together at what we call the Council of Nicaea, and that was in 325 years after Jesus was born. And at that council they decided, these are the writings we have let's combine them, let's group them, let's call them the New Testament. And so the time is quite fascinating, I think. Because even the stories of the early church, although we could write at that stage, and although people could write the stories down, it took 325 years before it was combined into a cohesive unit like we have today. It's a lot of time. A lot happened. And so how did we get it? Where were these things found? There was a collection of what we call manuscripts, called codexes, a collection of it that is called the Aleppo Codex, which around 920 years after Jesus was born, was a unit, and that for a time had been some of our oldest manuscripts that we had physical copies of. And then in 1947, a shepherd walking around the Dead Sea threw a stone into a cave, and he heard pots crack. And upon investigation, those were hidden treasures of manuscript, scrolls of scripts that had been hidden there for whatever reason. But it was such a significant find that pushed our oldest physical manuscripts back by 1,000 years. And so in that Dead Sea Scrolls, we found 800 manuscripts, of which 220 were of the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew writings. And we found it complete except for the book of Esther. It's not there. But the rest are all there. And fascinating, and if I go to Jerusalem one day, I'm not so much interested in, I want to see the museum. I want to see one specific thing, and that's the Isaiah scroll that is unrolled and displayed around a huge circle. It's a big, big, big work. I want to go see that. If I see nothing else, I'll be fine. I want to see the Isaiah scroll. But we found 2 of them at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In those pots, there were 2 of them. The one wasn't quite complete, about 75% complete. And the scrolls were made up of papyrus, which is a sort of paper that was made from plants that they sliced very thinly and laid over each other and had it dry. But they didn't have a long life. I mean, if I start rolling up my notes and unrolling it and rolling and unrolling it, eventually this would deteriorate to the point where we can't use it. It happened much quicker with papyrus. And that's how we got it. Because it had been seen as holy scriptures, you can't just throw it away or use it to the point where it's really disrespectful. So when it started to decay to the point where we really need to look after it, we'd rather roll it up, put it in a clay jar, seal it up, and then they put it typically in the temple walls. They built it into the temples. And one explanation as to why we don't have manuscripts, tons of it, that are very, very old, is that you might remember in 586 BC, so before Christ, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was broken down. And so any archives, shall I call it that might have been into the walls, probably were destroyed at that time. And so that's one idea as to why we found a cache of archives in a cave around the Dead Sea. And it's a wonderful environment. Luckily for us, it's such a great environment. It's dry, it's arid, it's probably very, very salty. And it was just perfect to preserve these. And so we have them. The New Testament wasn't kept in the temple, obviously so. And so where did we find that? So we found fragments of the scriptures in monasteries where they did kind of the same thing. They archived it when it became frail. But it was written by hand, so they weren't up to Martin Luther. What did he do? What's that word? Reformation. Thank you. I almost said Renaissance. Not the Renaissance, the Reformation. Up to the Reformation, the printing press wasn't there. So it was written out by hand. And the copies we found were often the copies with a mistake on it, because you couldn't circulate that for general use. So when the author, it was very expensive and very tedious, and you had to be awake and focused, and you can't make a mistake. And when they did make a mistake, they stopped. And they couldn't destroy it, because there was the mistake, but the rest of it was perfect, and you can't destroy the Word of God. So let's archive it. Let's put it somewhere. And so we found some of those. On papyrus, on parchment, we found it in various states. Some of it was written all in capitals, some of it was written in cursive italics, and so we have many, many, many fragments. To be precise is hard, but more than 5,800 fragments of the New Testament is currently in our possession. And the beauty of this, I remember when I was studying at the University of Pretoria, we had a great discussion about this. The beauty of this is that it was written down so precisely that the newest and the oldest ones didn't differ. And when they did, it was by very, very, very little. They were very careful to rewrite this in a way that honors the writings before, so much so that in some of the manuscripts we could realize there was a mistake made by an author somewhere along that line, and maybe some of the punctuation wasn't quite where it needed to be. The following writers copied the mistake. They didn't correct it because the source then was right, and so the mistake continued on. It's just a beautiful story. Maybe this is information overload and means nothing to you, and I'm sorry if that's the case. But lastly, about how we got it, is that we have other ancient writings too. And if I say we, it's the academics, the archaeologists. We have other ancient writings too. Plato wrote stuff down, Philo did, there's a lot of it. But we don't have there's nothing that has been reproduced in the volume that the New Testament was reproduced, even in ancient times. So the vast majority of what they find in caves and dug up somewhere is New Testament writings. The writings of Paul, the Gospels, that which we held today as the Bible. And all this to say, it has had a tremendous impact in the world as we know it. Sorry, I quoted this wrong. 5,800 fragments are in Greek. 10,000 additional fragments are in Latin. And another 9,500 manuscripts in different other languages like Slavic, Gothic, Coptic, Nubian, American, Ethiopian, different languages. And so I guess that is a good introduction as to where does this come from? How do we get it? Who wrote it? How old is it? Which brings us to today's reading. Timothy was instructed by Paul and encouraged by Paul to continue doing what he was doing. And at this stage, the New Testament had not been formed. So they didn't have the collection of the New Testament. And when Paul says to him, the scripture is God-breathed, he's referring to the Old Testament most likely. And I would like to conclude today not by unpacking the entire 2 Timothy or the entire book of Timothy, but by pointing to this. Verse 16, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, Why? And then he answers the why. So that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. If the revelation of God in these scriptures do not result in those who belong to God doing good works, we are not reading it right. It can't just be philosophical and inspirational, making us feel warm and fuzzy inside. It can't just be something for me. It has to spill over. It has to go into the actions, the works that is done by those who belong to God. May this be what we celebrate when we celebrate that we have a collection of ancient writings revealing God to us. It's an interpretive book. We cannot simply open a page and say, this was written specifically for 2023. We need to understand the context when it was written, the history surrounding that, what the original authors wanted to say. But what we cannot deny is that it is a revelatory book, revealing God even today. And in revealing God to us, it instructs us, it teaches us, it is a source of reproof and correction that we all need. And all of that happens so that we may be proficient and equipped for good work.